the most powerful takeaway in my mind would be for you to begin to look at how we have used history to support the healing work that needs to take place in our communities. There are a number of different groups that do slave trail walks or walks of the enslaved African. J-Rod, who we were talking to, he does reenactments with the group that he worked with, and there is power in that. But of all the groups that do walks, we are the only group that start our walks from here. And we start our walks from here for a number of reasons. The most important reason is we're able to validate sacred stories. See, sacred stories are important to the person or the group that story is sacred to. One of the things that I have learned from doing this is when I can validate your sacred story, it's much easier for you to validate my secret story. When we both validate each other's secret story, then we find a common ground that we can begin to build from. How do we find common ground in our history? And sometimes that common ground doesn't mean we see everything the same way. Finding that common ground is about finding your heart, because what's in your heart is what moves you. What in your heart is what shapes you. So from here, and I want you to get this because I know Selma. Selma, you have a gift in Selma similar to the gift that we have here in Richmond. This is a gift right here that we're standing on. Because when we arrive here, we talk about the sacred stories of four groups: Richmonders, Native Americans, African Americans, and Confederate soldiers. All four of their stories merge on this site. So when we arrive here, we will talk about, this is actually where Richmond was named from. So I will tell people, being a native Richmonder, this place is important to me because this is the city, my city that I love, where it was named from. And I'll tell people something like, I ain't gonna let you talk about my city, but I will. Sensitizing people to this journey that's leading. So everything that's done is about how do we create a methodology or a model that we can tell this story so people can come together. We can not deny this history, but we can own, O-W-N, this history. So I will break the ice like that, but then I would say, but we didn't ask the Native Americans whether we could name this city or not. And really when you look at that plaque over there, you will see that when William Byrd came up to this spot from down there, he looked down the river and it almost maps the Richmond on the Thames in London. So he claimed it in the name of the Queen. Okay? And when I talk about not asking the Native Americans, well, Native Americans buried their dead at the highest point of their communities. And this, from here to Richmond Hill, is the highest point in Richmond. So the probability of this having been a Native American burial ground is very, very high. So now I have shifted to something that I love and I respect, to something that was sacred, and it it peels back a part of a part of the ugly history that we have buried. See, as long as we can bury history, we don't have to deal with it. So now I've peeled back a part of that ugly history that we have tried to bury. That's the gift here. You have the same gift in Selma. It's how you unpack the gift that God has given us. And then I shift gears again to talk about my ancestors that have come, was born up and sold down this river. And there's a solemn sacredness about that. So me having lifted the pride and the truth, I can also now tell the solemnness and the truth about a history that we've also tried to either beautify, deny, or shift. And then I will talk about the statue. And I tell the whole truth about this statue, and that is, I've never liked this statue. And I tell why I don't like it, and that is because this statue represented the South will rise again. And when I say the South will rise again, that never means anything good for people of color, because it's reinforcing all the ugly of what we tried to bury. But then I will share with them, I say, however, I learned that 75% of all the males in the South between the age of 17 and 50 fought in the Civil War. And 36% of them was killed or maimed. And I will share that. And when I learned that, I could understand why they would build the statue. Because I understand the grief that a people go through because my ancestors were sold up and down this river. I could understand the grief because Native Americans were violated and they grieve. But then what you're doing is you are tying realities together. Grief is real. And how we deal with grief is different. So what we've done at this point is we validated everybody's sacred story. You're not going to move to healing until you're able to validate. And I will tell them, I still don't like this statue, but I understand why it was built. I sometimes share about how this statue had me in bondage. And that's the truth. Everything I'm saying is the truth. None of it is fictitious, none of it is made up. But it is about being able to bring different griefs or grievings into the same circle. When you're able to do that, then we have not only created a bond or a foundation to build from, but we've lowered a bar. Because when people come into this work and particularly white folks, one of their biggest challenges is they don't want to be the target. Okay? Guilt and shame are the two weapons of mass destruction when we're doing this work. So how do we create a foundation where guilt and shame isn't the elephant in the room? And then I will talk about history. And I say this almost every time I'm up here. I say history is like family. And I will share that we have everybody in their family. They got an Uncle Joe or Aunt Sally. And everybody will smile because they know what I'm talking about. And we wish that Uncle Joe or Aunt Sally wasn't in our family. But we can't trade them off. And when we try to act like they're not in their family, they show up and they show out. That's how history is. We try to bury the Uncle Joes and the Aunt Sallys in our families. And every time we try to bury them, they show up and they show up. Okay? So it's a nice little story to break some ice. It's to relieve some tension. But it's to build a camaraderie. Because if you're going to do this work, you have to build camaraderie. I will never love this statue, but I can respect why it was built. When we learn to respect why things were done, we're now better able. I will even say sometimes, I can wear a size 9 shoe, and you can wear a size 9 shoe, but your 9 is not going to fit just like my 9 fits my feet. So I don't I never try to make this such that I can ever walk in your shoes. And you can never walk in my shoes, but you can understand my walk. So that lays a foundation. And the question is, how do we lay a foundation to build upon? So now the person in this, again, a significant spot. For those of you that is in Richmond for the very first time, this is actually where Patrick Henry made his Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death speech. St. John's Church that led to the Civil War, the Revolutionary War. They do reenactments of that often. But the interesting thing is I don't spend a whole lot of time talking about Patrick Henry. I talk about what used to be on the site across the street. Across the street was where Elizabeth Van Loo's house was. I talked to some folk yesterday about Elizabeth Van Loo, but her house was across the street. Elizabeth Van Loo was a Northern sympathizer, and to be more specific, she was a Northern spy. Elizabeth Van Loo, this was the richest or the wealthiest area in Richmond at that time. By the way, historic church here still ain't that bad.
Folks still worship at the church?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Every Sunday.
Man.
And they have reenactments, as I said. But Elizabeth Van Loo's father owned a number of enslaved Africans. And when he died, he sort of willed, some of them left some to his wife, his daughter, and his son. One of those individuals that were left to Elizabeth Van Lew was a young lady by the name of Mary Bowser. Mary Bowser was a gifted person. Mary Bowser had a photographic memory. Elizabeth Van Lew actually freed her, sent her up north to be educated. Mary Bowser had such a love for her family, her father and mother, that she came back. And when she was back in Richmond is when the war broke out. Because Elizabeth Van Lew was in the inner circle of the rich and famous, she was friends with Verona Davis, who was Jefferson Davis's wife. So she needed a maid. So Elizabeth Van Lew said, I got the right girl for you. Sent Mary Bowser over to the White House of the Confederacy, and with her photographic memory, all of the strategies that Jefferson Davis and his lieutenants and generals plotted with her photographic memory. She just went around, click, 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 brought the information back to Elizabeth Van Lew. Elizabeth Van Lew ran it through the pipeline and got to General Lee. General Grant. And Grant said the most valuable information that he received out of Richmond came from Elizabeth Van Lew, which means that
I get a T-shirt with these sisters on it.
Which means it actually came from Mary Bowser. And what I do with this information is I do two things. Not only do I tell the story, and by the way, Maggie Walker was probably born in that house because Maggie Walker's mother worked for Elizabeth Van Lew's mother.
So that school, the former house, it sits on the same ground?
It sits on the same ground.
Okay.
After Elizabeth Van Lew died in 1910, they tore the house down. And they built this school in 1911. But what I do at this spot is I talk about two things that's important outside of the story that was told. And that is that women played a role in the victory for the Union. And African Americans fought for their freedom.
That's right.
See, too often we are taught and we buy into the fact that everything was given to us.
Yeah.
When you listen to arguments around affirmative action, they want something for nothing. At some point, I don't always talk about it here, but I do talk about it on the trail, that 186,000 African Americans fought in the Civil War. Information that's not known, that's not shared, because if that violates the perception that everything was given to us. But here we had a free woman. As a matter of fact, those 186 mostly fought for on the side of the Union.
Great.
Okay, those who fought for the South, they fought mostly in two different ways, because some masters took their slaves or their enslaved individuals to continue to serve them even during the war. And then when the South did not think winning the war was in their favor, they offered freedom to other enslaved Africans to fight. So you have to understand that story. But when you don't, when you have to, again, it's an opportunity to break down some of the stereotypes that we deal with and the perceptions that we deal with that have us in the place that we are in right now. So we have to continue to chip away at the perceptions of the frame of mind. It also helps individuals to understand the peculiar dynamics of that institution. By the way, Elizabeth Van Loo was awarded for her work. She was awarded the role of Postmaster General in Richmond, and she was probably the first female Postmaster General in the U.S. That's how Grant rewarded her. Okay? So again, understanding why we do some things with this history. We have to continually chip away at perceptions that have been created, and perceptions become realities, and perceptions become truths when they're not challenged. Okay? So we forget that this peculiar institution have so many layers, and we think we can just get a drill and do. And the reality is you have to learn how to peel back all of those layers. And if you don't peel back those layers, you build that wall back up. And when you start lowering that wall, tearing down that wall, you can't give firepower to rebuild the wall. Because once you get them in that place where you begin to penetrate their heart, you have to stay zeroed in. So all the history stuff is good, but what's the intent and the purpose behind it? Does that make sense?
The agenda. What's your agenda? You know,
right.
What's your agenda?
So
are you for real, or are you trying to exploit, or you know?
And our intent is to bring people to a place where their thinking shifts enough so they can see different. Because we forget how thick a wall we have, this institution have built. That's how come it's been able to sustain itself without much effort. Is because there was a systematic way of building this wall. There have to be a systematic way of tearing it down.
It's ironic to me, though, that the spot where Patrick Henry gives his, give us liberty or give me death is right across the street from where she's born, where she was a spy, and Martha was born.
And the truth is,
really something.
They believe the same thing on the other side of the
street.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Give me liberty.
Hey, that's what I'm talking about.
So the dynamics, they are very, very, and we talk about that sometimes, particularly Cricket, who does a lot of these walks with me. But that's the peculiarness of this institution, man. It's crazy. So, and again, Maggie Walker came out of that site, and what she's done, or what she did as a pioneer is unquestionable. Anybody have?
Would you tell us what you did for that sake? So go ahead, everybody.
First of all, Maggie Walker, and y'all passed her statue yesterday.
Beautiful statue.
Maggie Walker was the first female bank president in the United States, black or white. She started out as a secretary. If you ever go to her house and see the title she had, about 10 different things. She was secretary, but she rose up in the St. Luke order and she basically became president and of the St. Luke Order, and she opened the first penny savings and loan. And that savings and loan became one of the most respected banks, black banks. The interesting thing is in 1909 or 1908, when there was a recession, and by the way, there were about 6 or 7 black banks in Richmond. We have to understand the financial magnitude of African Americans in Richmond during that time. One thing we haven't talked about, that about 20% of the African Americans in Richmond were free blacks. Okay, but when that crisis, a recession hit, the black banks merged and became consolidated banks, and they still selected Maggie Walker to be the president.
Well, and were a lot of them college educated? If so, what schools? I think Booker T. Washington came through.
No, Booker T. Washington did not come from
Virginia,
Richmond.
not from Richmond. But,
No,
But he came to Hampton, though.
Came to
Hampton.
Hampton.
Yeah, he came from Roanoke, but he went to Hampton.
Right.
I don't have the educational background of many of them, but there was a wonderful newspaper. What is Robert Mitchell was a reporter who actually Tiger Tom Mitchell actually knew him.
Oh, really?
Yes, because
Because he's old enough, huh?
Yeah, because he was Tiger Tom was 100 when he died a couple months ago, so he knew Robert Mitchell at a young age, and it helped him in journalism.
Inspired him.
You third generation.
Yeah, I'm shooting for the 100. and literally, to be like him, no, he really was a he was a jam up guy, and he knew history.
He was. So Maggie Walker, at one time there were 7 branches in Richmond of Consolidated Bank. In 2009, it sort of died with the movement of
When
banks
the home thing went
sucking up smaller banks, and unfortunately there was a change in leadership. So,
How do you spell Martha's last name?
who?
Is it Martha Exposure?
The one with the spy.
Mary?
Oh, are you talking about Elizabeth Van Loo or
And
Mary Bowser?
Mary. I thought it was Mary.
Mary Bowser, B-O-W-S-E-R. So, B-O-W-S-E-R.
Okay.
So we're going to get in the cars and go to the other side. I tell people, we have 17 signs erected along the trail. I was doing slave trail walks before we erected the first sign, so I don't use the signs. but I'm a part of the slave trail commission that developed these signs. But I'm an old fogey and I don't change quickly. But this is where most of the groups start their walk. And at this site, the first thing that I do is I give a little history. And I talk about changing, I talk about language. Language is very important in doing this work. We either break cycles we can break cycles with language, or we can perpetuate cycles with language, or we can remain complicit with the status quo with language. And one of the things that I talk about is asking people to consider when they talk about individuals that were slaves, we changed the name from slaves to enslaved. It's important that we humanize individuals, even as we talk about this institution. When I talk about the institution, I talk about I would use the term slave. But when I'm talking about the individuals, we have to use the term enslaved, because we were considered to be 3/5 of a human. And when we call individuals slaves, we perpetuate that demonization of a people. And when we subconsciously support the demonization of a people, beasts are feared. So when someone confuses a cigarette lighter for a gun, that fear shows up, and I pull my gun and I shoot you. So much of it is based on, the subconscious status of a black man, that we still see them as being beasts and not humans. That's buried in our subconscious. So we have to break that cycle. We have to humanize individuals, because when we begin to humanize them, we begin to see them differently. So I ask people to be conscious about using the term enslave over slave. Okay? And then I will share some of the history of this institution. One thing I will remind people that Virginia, and I usually would throw this out as a question as opposed to just sharing the way I'm sharing now, I would ask them who was the #1 importer of enslaved Africans in America. And you always get a few different answers, but Louisiana was the #1 importer of enslaved Africans. But when I ask the question, it's just to engage the group, because you don't want to just tell them stuff all the time. You want to, have some kind of communication lines as much as possible. And then I would ask them who was the #1 exporter of enslaved Africans. And the answer would be Virginia. At the height of the transatlantic slave trade, Virginia sold 10,000 enslaved Africans down the river a month. I would also remind individuals that the U.S., only 5% of all the captured Africans were brought to the U.S. Only 5%. So when we start talking about the magnitude and the impact it had on America, we have to also understand the impact it's had on the world, and more specifically the impact it's had on Africa. The majority of the enslaved Africans or captured Africans went to Brazil. But there were 5 or 6 different places where more captured Africans went than came to America. So now the mindset is, this thing is much bigger than what we've ever understood it to be. I would share with them that 51% of the revenue of Richmond at one time was based on the slave trade. So now you are not only given some vital history, you're opening some eyes to some things that very few people know. Everything that I said before I said it. How many of y'all knew everything that I just shared? So now we are beginning to broaden the understanding. One of the greatest challenges for me doing this work, because I come from a background where I was more revolutionary than I was reconciliatory. but I realized that didn't get me too far. And I've accomplished more of being a reconciler than I was a revolutionary. But when you have that spirit in you, you want to fight. You want to win fights. But you can't fight, or you fight differently when you know you're fighting against somebody that don't know stuff. And for me to come to the understanding that whites were as ignorant to this knowledge as African Americans were, then it sensitized me, and I never liked that, but I appreciate it. I've never liked it because I like that revolutionary part of me, a person that's in me. But that's the truth. We were all duped by this. The one thing that I didn't say up there that I will remind people, I do that sacred story piece to remind people that, you know, this history that I talked about, we try to bury. We have to own it. And when we own it, then we can deal with it better. And as an African American, I could not own the pride I have in Richmond being named here and not own the ugly of our enslaving my people. So it can't be mine in one situation and yours in the other. It have to be ours. So that was something I didn't share up there that I normally share here. And then I share a story that, and again, this is a gift. There are gifts that you have that's different than this gift that I have. But the story that I have is a gift. And the story I tell, it's a true story. When I went to Benin, we visited Ouida, which is the former capital of Benin, or at that time, Dahomey. And then Ouida is where, and by the way, Benin was one country that willfully participated in the transatlantic slave trade. And and when we went to Ouida, and by the way, in case we don't get to it, and as the president came in, he felt that he needed to apologize for his country's role in the transatlantic slave trade. I'll save the rest of that story for when we get to the reconciliation statue. But we were there for the unveiling of a statue that we have here in Richmond as well. And we went to Ouida, and when we went to Ouida, there was a place called the Point of No Return. That is where the enslaved Africans were taken from the bank to the shore and embarked on the ships to take off. And I share the story of my personal experience when I was at that point, and to this day I couldn't figure out what it was, whether it was my ego, whether it was my need, whether it was a statement that a native son have returned home. I don't know, but I knew that I had to walk from the banks to the shore and back. And as soon as I stepped outside of that structure, I literally became paralyzed. And all I could do was lean on that structure and weep. Interestingly, a colleague of ours, Lawrence Fearon from London, I think Lawrence had met Lawrence, from London, same thing happened to him. The rest of the delegation walked, and Lawrence and I stood on that structure, and we just wept the whole 15 or 20 minutes that they were gone. But when I was weeping, some things reflected in my mind. I had been doing walks on this side of the river for 10 years at that time, but this was the first time I got to do it on the other side of the world. I did it where they arrived, now I did it where they were shipped from. And then I began to think about having done walks from this side, and I thought about the earth and the connection that Africans have with their land. And it was spiritual. It was a spiritual connection that Africans have with the land. And then I began to smell the air there as opposed to the air here, and I realized that there was something social that I was now disconnected from. And then I heard the birds chirping and the insects chirping, and I thought about the difference in the chirping here and the chirping there, and it was cultural. So everything cultural, spiritually, culturally, and socially was ripped away from people. So I asked people to consider everything spiritually, culturally, and socially being stripped away from you. When I asked that question after telling that story, that wall sinks a little bit lower. It comes down a little bit lower. Not only is the story truthful, hard for you to deny my story. And when your story is truthful, you tell it with a conviction. Even as I try to just tell it as an example, I still have the same feeling that I have when I tell it during the walk. It's just something about the authenticity of the story that will always impact me and change my life. So what is the story that you have that can make a difference in how people see this history and how this history impacts individuals? Sometimes I will share how, well, not sometimes, I also share about individuals being disembarked at night because they didn't want the women and the children to smell the stench or see the horrific nature of individuals walking from here to Shaka, where we will be visiting shortly. So when you think about that, you think about the peculiarity of this institution. See, when they were sold downriver, usually they had them shined up and dressed up. But when they were coming upriver, they weren't that way. So now you are getting to the heartstring of people. And I would admit, the heartstring of women get tugged quicker and differently than that of men. Not saying that the men heartstring isn't tugged on. And then what I would do is I would ask us to honor them because when they were disembarked, they were yoked and chained, and they were required to walk in silence. So what I normally do at that point is ask people to form a line, and because we are just doing some things, we're not going to do all that, even though I want to walk us to the mouth of the trail. But we would join hands like this, and we would ask to walk in silence, and we would start our walk. Okay, so if you can imagine all of what's been shared when you're in silence, all of those things from there to Elizabeth Van Loo to the story is now having some spiritual germination in us. And I don't ever try to figure out what it is in each individual, but there are some stuff in us that's beginning to, and it's inside of us, it's not up here. Okay? And because this work requires us to get to the heart of people, because we believe that change inside out. So we're going to just walk up here so I can let you see the mouth of the trail. But all that time we would be walking. There were so many enslaved Africans in the state of Virginia that bringing more in was competition. So when they outlawed it, it was to our advantage. But the reality is we shift from being complicit in that institution to being players, intentional players in that institution. So, and that's a different mindset. It's a different frame of reference when I'm just going along with stuff, and as opposed to when I'm imposing stuff. I will talk about the term being sold down. I'll ask the question before I tell them, what does being sold down river mean to you? And normally it means what? Being betrayed. Okay? And I will again share this sometimes, just break the ice. I said, well, some people say that was corn here in Virginia, and other people would say it was corn in Ohio or someplace else. And then I'll let them know, since we're in Virginia, it was corn here in Virginia. Something to just break the monotony of the impact of this experience. And then I will share the story of Henry Box Brown. And J-Rod, he reenacts Henry Box Brown at time. But Henry Box Brown was an individual, and this is how it worked. The master would say, if you be a good slave, we'll keep your family together. And many times, or they would say, if you're not, we're going to sell you down river. But in many cases, they were good slaves, and I'm using the term from an institutional standpoint now. And Henry Box Brown was a good slave, but they sold his wife and children downriver. He was so distraught that he had himself shipped on the other side of the river to Philadelphia in a box. And that was a 26, 27-hour boat ride from Virginia, from Richmond to Philadelphia at that time. And he became an abolitionist.
Like secretly had himself.
Yeah, and there was a white doctor that helped him. So once he got to Philadelphia, he became an abolitionist. He never reconnected with his family. But that's an example of being sold downriver. Okay? And after we do that, we will usually stop and just have folk ask them questions about their feelings, about the difference between walking one way and the other. And different things come up. And we never try to design what that is, just let the spirit have its way. And the reactions that we've experienced just been all over the board. Believe it or not, the most impactful experience that I recall is when I did this walk with women from Benin, well, a group from Benin, and how the women responded. They did not want to leave this spot. It was, and it reflected on something that was shared with me when I was in Benin. And that is, we wonder where we come from, but they wonder where their family went. Now, the power in that is, we were always taught to not to trust Africans or to think that we were better than they are. Another statement of the complexity and the layers of this institution is a power has been to divide and conquer. So if I don't have any connection to Africa, I don't have any sympathy toward Africa. And at the same time, they fought the Africans to think that they were. This information for our 1993 walk, and she actually died in 1994.
Wow.
And then we were able to just authenticate that. We happened to have in Richmond a guy named Phil Schwartz, who was, Phil was one of the leading Civil War historians in the country. And he was on the commission with us. So, you know, I tell people, and the reason I've been able to do this work for as long as I have, is really God's work. And because of God, because it's His work, I've seen Him do some things. You know, sometimes you just have to step into your call, and as you step, you know, we want to be able to see all the way down the road, and sometimes God say, all you can see is the next step. So I got down the road under control. And that's what I have found this work to be for me. We've had to fight people trying to prevent us from doing this work more than we've had to fight getting the work done.
What kind of people have fought against this kind of work? Who's fought against it?
Different people with different agendas. Some people don't want the history to be told. Some people want to tell the history in a way that is pleasing to them.
That's right.
And sometimes they're not just white folks, they're African Americans. You know, right now we're in the process of having this site turned into a structure, potentially a museum. And there's opposition.
Competition for funding maybe, or just not wanting the story told?
They don't want the story told the way we're trying to tell it.
Do any of those people trying to keep the city polarized or make the city polarized, or you think?
Well, I think people have their own agendas. And whatever your agenda is, it drives what you do and how you do it. We really probably, I was hoping to be at Richmond Hill at this point, and we were going to have a debrief period, go to chapel, and then at 12:30 we were going to have lunch, and then at 2 o'clock we had people coming over. We may have to do the debrief after lunch, because I don't know whether we're not going to be able to get back in time for chapel, but we will be back in time for lunch.
Chapel where?
At Richmond Hill, they have a rhythm of life in that facility, and they have prayer 3 times a day, 7, 12, and 6 o'clock, and they ask people in the house to share with that time, and during that prayer time, they pray for the city. They would probably have included, and since they know that you guys were coming in town and you were going to be there, you were probably on their prayer list for the day. That's part of why we've always done work with them, is they carry that spiritual component of this work in a way that we can't. Even though we have a spiritual base to it, they are a spiritual retreat center. So they carry this work from that perspective in a powerful way. But this Lovekins jail site, there was a sign that we did not get to see because we really didn't do the walk. There was a sign, and we have some brochures that we're going to give you. But there was a sign dealing with the Creole Revolt. The Creole Revolt tells the story of 100 enslaved Africans that were being sold to New Orleans. And the captain, the enslaved Africans overthrew the captain and his ship and demanded that they take the ship to the Bahamas. The Bahamas was a colony of England, and because it was a colony of England, England had outlawed the institution of slavery so they would become free. Robert Lumpkins owned half of those enslaved individuals that were on the ship. The interesting and peculiarity of this institution was that the enslaved Africans remained free on the Bahamas, but the insurance companies had to pay for the property that they lost because we were considered property. So it's another story of African Americans fighting for their freedom and not just being given everything. So you have to be able to reinforce those stories of persistence, and you have to reinforce those stories of bravery. All of those things help tear down some of the precepts and mindsets that we fight against when we try to bring healing to our communities. And this is where Robert Lumpkin's compound sat. And when I say this was a compound, it had his house, it had a jail, it had a restaurant, and it had a hotel on it. The enslaved Africans called this the Devil's Half Acre because of the horrific nature of this site. This site actually goes 15 feet deep, and each one of those, we were able to do an excavation on this, and then we covered it back up. So in the excavation, you can see all three of the different layers. This site is important, and we use this site as a transitional point in this journey of healing. There was an individual by the name of Anthony Burns who was a test case for the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law. Fugitive Slave Law stated, well, let's say prior to 1850, if you were a runaway and you made it up north, you were free. But the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law stated that if you went up north and they knew you were a runaway, if they didn't turn you in, they would face criminal charges. Anthony Burns was a test case for that. He was a runaway from Hanover, and he went to Boston. They fought it in court, and of course, they lost. So Anthony Burns was sent back to Virginia, and he actually spent 4 months on Lumpkin's jail on this site. And he either wrote or he dictated to a writer about his experience and the horrific nature of staying here. Lumpkin was considered one of the most notorious jailers in Virginia and possibly the South. That's why the enslaved Africans called this area the Devil's Half Acre.
So it's true that he had a black wife?
Yes, that's what I'm getting ready to tell you. That's okay. Good that you read.
Yeah.
But I found, and again, how peculiar this institution is. Robert Lumpkins, and he couldn't legally marry Mary, but he had who was considered his wife, and they had 5 children together. I believe that she was able to hit his heartstring like no one else, because he was really very notorious in this institution. And it turns out that in his will, he willed his assets to the mother of his children because he couldn't wield anything but freedom to an enslaved person. Fortunately, he died in 1866, which was a year after the institution of slavery was over. So the will couldn't be contested. So she was awarded his assets. In 1867, a Baptist minister by the name of Nathaniel Culver came to Richmond looking for a place to start a school. He felt that free blacks needed to be educated, and more specifically from a spiritual perspective. After running out of options, I don't know if he had a by chance encounter with Mary or she was referred to him. But in either case, Mary leased this facility to Nathaniel Colvin to start the school. The school later merged with two other schools and formed what is now known as Virginia Union University.
I didn't know that.
This is where Virginia Union got its start. Now, what I do, I have fun at this point, I share history at this point, and then I make a point at this point. All of those things are relevant in bringing down that wall. I would ask people, since I mentioned Virginia Union, I would mention Doug Wilder. Doug Wilder was a alumni of Virginia Union, and Doug Wilder was the first elected African American governor. And then I would ask the question, who was the first African American governor in the U.S.? I knew you knew. Pickney Pinchback. And I asked that, and most people don't know, Pickney Pinchback was the governor of Louisiana, 1872. In 1872, he was elected senator. The lieutenant governor died and he was appointed lieutenant governor, and then the governor was impeached and he became governor. But I remind people that was 1872. We had an African American governor in the state. And then I remind them that there were more African American political leaders in the South 15 years after the institution of slavery than there were up until 20 years ago. And I would ask them what happened. That's when I bring up y'all Constitution. Y'all, I've been waiting to get some Alabama folks. I had some Georgia folk. I done had some Mississippi folk. First time I got me some Alabama folk. to remind them that it was your 1901 Constitution that changed the trajectory from that institution to the constitutional state. And in that Constitution, in case some of you don't know, Alabama's Constitution of 1901 was 3.5 times larger than any constitution in the world. Larger than the U.S. Constitution. 3.5 times larger than any in the world. And it was filled with black codes or Jim Crow laws. So now, from a constitutional standpoint, we're forced to live under conditions that made one group better than the other group. But it also triggered the constitutions of other states. An example of that is the Constitution of Virginia, 1902 Constitution of Virginia. Virginia had 217,000 registered African American voters, and overnight in 1902, overnight that number was decreased to 21,000. When I shared that, people began to see something a little bit different. 21,000. So Jim Crow laws made this institution constitutional. So not only did that impact voting, it impacted economic growth and empowerment, it impacted educational opportunities and access. So when we talk about what we're dealing with today, we're dealing with the tentacles from that institution. So now as we've done all that we've done, and now their minds are open to something else. So now we can see how these laws were stacked against a group to prevent growth opportunities. Now affirmative action can make some sense to people that it made no sense to, because constitutionally we stole opportunities away from people. So again, using this site for multiple purposes. The history is powerful. Peeling back the layer, again, becomes more powerful and impactful. Okay? We're going to run to the statue.
It took 2 months.
It did. 2 months to come up with the language.
Like David, not just
I got to go real quick, down and dirty on this spot, because we've got to get to Richmond Hill in 10 minutes, 12 minutes. This is the site of the reconciliation statue. There is a reconciliation triangle. There's a statue like this in Benin, Liverpool, and Richmond. I shared with you earlier about the president of Benin feeling that he needed to apologize for his country's role in the transatlantic slave trade. Well, Matthew Carriacou was a army colonel who overthrew the government and was a dictator in Benin for 17 years. His government was communist and he practiced voodoo. He had a Christian conversion. As a part of his Christian conversion, he changed his government from a communist form of government to a democracy, and he did not run for president the first time. After the first term, he ran and he won overwhelmingly. And because he believed that his country could not be whole until he apologized for his role in the transatlantic slave trade, he invited individuals from the diaspora to come to Benin, and he offered an apology. One of our colleagues, or former colleagues, Paige Shagors, was a part of that delegation. When she came back to Richmond, she felt we needed to do something. And what we did was to create this triangle between Liverpool, Benin, and us. And as I said, we have a statue erected in each one of those 3 countries. The story I shared about my experience in Benin was when I went for their unveiling. I was actually the person that went to Liverpool on behalf of Richmond to receive this statue. And the statue was constructed by an individual by the name of Stephen Broadbent, who was from Liverpool. And Stephen and his friend had a falling out. And as a part of that falling out, he created this statue, and it was adopted as the model for the reconciliation statue. So Paige thought we should do something to keep the connection between Liverpool, Benin, and the U.S. intact. Youth. One of the things that we did was we assembled youth in Richmond to frame the base of the statue. Youth from Liverpool built one side, Africa one side, the U.S. one side. And we had a contest in the school, again bringing other individuals into this circle of healing. And these are the words of youth. They collected a couple sayings from a few youth, and they came up with this term, what is reconciliation? And up here it's in French because Benin is a French-speaking country. They were colonized by France. But if you follow the story on the statue, England built 40% of all the ships in the slave trade. So the ships would leave Liverpool full with dry goods. And it would travel from Liverpool to the west coast of Africa. And while in Africa, they would trade the dry goods for human cargo. Now, I need to be clear that there were also individuals that didn't do bad in Benin. Some of their kings did pretty good. So it wasn't just dry goods, it was also some money involved, even though they got the shorter end of the trade. But they were traded for human cargo. The interesting thing about this is the African kids wanted the Sankofa bird to be a part of their display. And for those of you that don't understand the story of the Sankofa bird, it's a mythical bird, but it's a bird that says that we've got to look back to move forward. Too often we don't want to look back, but that's embedded in their DNA, which it means it's really embedded in ours. We just got to dig a little deeper. And then it would take the human cargo and bring it to the U.S. and unload it. Right here you see what looks like a slave ship. What this would be a slave ship. Each one of these dents would represent a person. Individuals were packed in 18 by 48 inch spaces. Only about 70% of the cargo would make it to the U.S. And then they would trade the human cargo for wheat and sugar, things that did not grow well in Europe. So the ship never sailed by itself. And it was like leaving home this morning with $1, getting home this evening, you got $100. But other things that I learned, I was fortunate enough to go into the archives. And in the archives, they pull out these ledgers. About 10 different artifacts they brought out, but one of them was a ledger. In that ledger, I saw the economic impact of this institution. But the thing that struck me more than anything, the curator said to me, there are 7 or 8 families still prominent in Liverpool today. Those maps and ledgers were from 1700. So now you begin to see not only the financial impact, but you begin to hear the mindset to sustain that institution. So now we've got to begin to deal with the mindset that has sustained an institution. Those are the individuals that don't show up on Forbes' list, but their impact. So when we realize that that impact strikes all of us, we have to realize that it takes all of us to turn that back. So we sort of close with that, ask some questions. What we're going to do now is we're going to go to Richmond Hill. We will have lunch, and at 1:30 we will assemble